Senator, President Trump just tweeted telling Democrats to help Republicans make changes to immigration reform. You caucus with the Democrats. You're in the minority in the Senate. You're in the minority in the House. You don't hold the White House. When it comes to immigration, what specifically are Democrats willing to compromise on?
Well, Jake, the problem we have is we have a president who is not serious about policy, a president who lies every single day, a president who told us that he couldn't do anything about ripping children from the arms of their mothers that had to be in Congress, and then 2 days later he passed an executive order. So that's the first problem we have. Clearly, anyone who looks at the record understands that the Democrats in Congress have been serious about comprehensive immigration reform. That's what the American people want, and a path towards citizenship for people who are undocumented. Democrats are serious about dealing with the DACA crisis in this country. 80% of the American people think that we should provide legal status to the 1.8 million people in the DACA program. President rescinded Obama's executive order. These young people raised in the United States, in school, working, are now fearful about being deported. So what we need is comprehensive immigration reform. We need Obama, we need Trump now to make it clear that the United States of America is not a nation which tears children from their parents.
But Senator,
and then we need to get about dealing with comprehensive immigration reform.
I didn't hear you say anything there that you're willing to compromise on. For example, in exchange for, or as part of a larger legislative package on immigration reform that includes the steps you just took, you just outlined, would you be willing to support a border wall, for example? Would you be willing to go to more of a merit-based immigration system?
Jake, I held my nose and very reluctantly voted for some money for a border wall. That's what we voted for. We couldn't get even that legislation passed because it protected the young people in DACA. We had minimal amount of Republican support. But let us be very clear. What the president is now trying to do is to divide the American people up, whether it is, in this case, immigration, whether it is the needs of African Americans, whether it is the needs of minorities in general. What he's trying to do is divide us up and not focusing on the real issues that impact the American people. Well, immigration is a very important issue, but so is the rising cost of health care. So is the fact that we pay the highest prices in the world for prescription drugs. So is the fact Trump talks about the needs of the American worker. You got millions of people working longer hours for low wages. The president's job is to bring people together to address the problems that we face, not to divide us up and not to demagogue against desperate people who are coming into this country.
Well, you call it demagoguery. President Trump says that he is giving voice to people who don't get heard from. For instance, he's suggesting that Democrats need to focus more on the victims of crime committed by undocumented immigrants instead of looking at the children separated at the border. I want you to take a listen at this from President Trump on Friday.
These are the stories that Democrats and people that are weak on immigration, they don't want to discuss, they don't want to hear, they don't want to see, they don't want to talk about.
How do you respond to President Trump making that argument? How come Democrats... Go ahead.
I respond in two ways. Number one is I understand that the crime rate among undocumented people is actually lower than the general population. Number two, where was Trump bemoaning the fact that we had a guy in Las Vegas shooting down dozens and dozens of Americans? We had a young American walking into a high school in Parkland, Florida, shooting down kids. Crime is terrible. Murder is terrible. Let's deal with those issues, and let's not suggest that the only causes of crime are coming from undocumented people. But once again, what our job is a government is to address the issues facing the American people. And time again, Jake, we have a president who lied to the American people, a president who told us he was going to take on the pharmaceutical industry. He lied. Drug prices are going up all across this country. He was going to guarantee during his campaign health care to everybody. More and more people have no health insurance. The cost of health care is going up. Unemployment is low. But for millions of workers, real wages are going down because of the cost of affordable housing, soaring, prescription drugs soaring, gasoline at the pump soaring.
So, Senator, I want to ask you, several Democrats were tweeting recently about this photograph of showing children, undocumented children, in a government holding cell. It turns out the photograph was taken in 2014 under the Obama administration during the unaccompanied minors crisis from that year. Now reports say undocumented children in government custody in Virginia were allegedly beaten and left in solitary confinement. Again, that was under the Obama administration. How do you respond to critics who say Democrats only seem to start caring about these children under Trump?
That's not accurate. I think if you remember, there was a lot of discussion and a lot of concern about how undocumented people were treated under Obama. But under Obama, there was not a policy that says if you are a mom with a little boy coming over the country, we're going to grab that boy, put him into a detention center, which will clearly cause long-term psychological problems for that kid. That was not the policies of the Obama administration. That must never be the policies of the United States of America. We have to deal once again with immigration through comprehensive immigration reform. Trump caused this problem just as he caused the DACA problem.
More than a dozen Democratic congressional candidates reportedly support abolishing or defunding ICE, the Immigration and Customs Enforcement Agency, including candidate for governor of New York, Cynthia Nixon, who tweeted this week, quote, ICE is a terrorist organization and its egomaniacal leader is Donald Trump. Sign our petition to hashtag abolish ICE. Do you agree that ICE should be abolished?
I think what we need is to create policies which deal with immigration in a rational way. And a rational way is not locking children up in detention centers or separating them from their mothers. What we need is Trump to sit down with members of Congress and work on a rational program which deals with a serious issue.
Trump created the mess over separating families at the border with his new zero-tolerance policy, and that he alone can fix it. But what is their answer for stemming the tide of illegal immigrants coming into the U.S.? Joining us now, Jay Johnson, President Obama's Secretary of Homeland Security, who had to deal with a spike in illegal crossings back in 2014. Mr. Secretary, President Trump says the real cause of our immigration problems are weak laws and what he calls open border Democrats. Take a look.
They just want everyone to be released into our country, no matter how dangerous they are. They can be killers, they can be thieves, they can be horrible people. The Democrats say it's okay for them to be in our country.
Mr. Secretary, does the president have a point?
Chris, first of all, thanks for having me on. Chris, I'm not going to go down the road of the normal Washington blame game, Trump versus Obama, Obama versus Bush, or what have you. We have an underlying humanitarian crisis on our southern border that we must deal with, and in Central America. The high in illegal migration was 18 years ago. It is now a fraction of what it used to be, but the demographic has changed. It's women and children coming from Central America. As you point out, we saw a spike in 2014. We did a number of things to deal with it. We had the second lowest number in apprehensions on our southern border in 2015 since 1972. But then the numbers started to creep up again. And so this is a problem that is international in scope. I applaud Mike McCall for his leadership on the bill he discussed with you, but we've got to address this problem at the root cause. In Central America, the poverty and violence in Central America that motivates women and children to come here in the first place. And we started on that in the Congress 2 years ago, and I hope Congress continues on that road.
Well, and we'll get to that a little bit later, but obviously you're not going to solve the problems quickly, which are pretty systemic in Guatemala and Honduras and El Salvador.
Without a doubt.
I want to talk to you about some specific things. I'm not playing the political blame game. I'm talking about issues. And one of them, the president says, in the Trump administration, that part of the problem is a measure that was written by Democratic Senator Dianne Feinstein in 2008 that became law if a minor, an unaccompanied minor or child comes across the border from Mexico or Canada, we can send them immediately back to their country. But under the Feinstein Amendment, if it's a non-contiguous country like Central America, not right on our border, they can't be sent back immediately. Hasn't that contributed especially to the spike in unaccompanied minors coming into this country over the last few years?
Well, Chris, what you're referring to is the TVPRA passed in 2008. And as you point out, it does say that an unaccompanied child from Central America, a non-contiguous country, cannot be sent back immediately. Now, there's a certain amount of common sense behind that, because you can't just simply send an unaccompanied child back across the southern border into Mexico. You cannot repatriate a Guatemalan to Mexico. And so that law, which has a certain level of protections for children, we're talking about unaccompanied children, 5- and 6-year-old kids, requires that the Department of Homeland Security place that child with HHS within 48 hours. A deportation proceeding is commenced, and the child has a right through a lawyer to assert a claim for asylum.
Secretary Johnson, the fact is, we talk all about the children who are separated from their families. Of the 12,000 children that are in the system, 2,000 are children separated from families, 10,000 are unaccompanied minors. The perhaps unintended consequence of this amendment is that unaccompanied minors have flooded the area, a lot of them brought by coyotes, smugglers into the country.
Well, Chris, even if that law did not exist, it would not be simply a matter of expediting the removal of an unaccompanied child. There are certain due process rights that they have anyway. And when we repatriate somebody, and the Trump administration knows this, when you repatriate somebody to Central America has to agree to take them back. You have to put them on planes. It's a very measured process. And so the TVPRA in 2008 was put in place to make certain that we treat unaccompanied children, we're talking about unaccompanied children, in a fair way.
I understand that. Let's look, because you mentioned it, at how the Obama administration and you as Secretary of Homeland Security handled this back in 2014, when there was also a spike in children, most of them unaccompanied, coming across the border. You started jailing entire families. In some cases, not a lot, but in some, you separated children from their parents. And these pictures that we're putting up from 2014 show pictures of unaccompanied minors in effect, jail situations. As you look back on that, did you handle it so well?
Well, Chris, without a doubt, the images and the reality from 2014, just like 2018, are not pretty. And so we expanded family detention. We had then 34,000 beds for family detention, only 95 of 34,000 equipped to deal with families. So we expanded it. I freely admit it was controversial. We believed it was necessary at the time. I still believe it is necessary to maintain a certain capability for families. We can't have catch and release. And in my 3 years, we deported or repatriated or returned over 1 million people. But again, you can deal with this on the border. You can try different things. We did not want to go so far as separate families, but unless we deal with the underlying causes that are motivating people to come here in the first place, we're going to continue to bang our heads against the wall on this issue.
All right, so let's look at the problem that President Trump is trying to address right now. Let's put it up on the screen. 40 to 50,000 people cross the border illegally each month. Last month, 9,500 family members crossed the border illegally, and up to 40,000 unaccompanied minors cross per year. When I was talking this week to a top member of the Trump administration, and I told him you were going to be on the show, he said, I have one question for Secretary Johnson. What is the Democrat solution? How would they deal? I mean, it's easy to say, well, we got to fix Central America, but come on, that isn't going to solve the 40,000, 50,000 coming each month, certainly not anytime soon. How would you deal with that flood of people coming over the border now?
Well, I'll tell you Jay Johnson's solution. Continue our border security efforts. Give the Border Patrol, give immigration enforcement the tools they need, but let's not go so far as to separate families, but also continue what Congress started 2 years ago, aid to Central America to deal with the poverty and violence, and also encourage other countries in the region, Mexico, Belize, Costa Rica, Panama, to develop their own systems for asylum, for refugee processing. It was someone from the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops who told me in 2014, you can't just simply padlock a burning building without providing people with an alternative path to safety. And so we need to develop those additional paths for getting out of that Central
respectfully,
America.
that isn't going to solve the problem anytime soon. It won't solve it for months. It probably wouldn't solve it for years if we put $750 million, which is what we did during the Obama administration, into foreign aid in those three countries. They're pretty broken countries. You've got a real crisis on the border with 50,000 people a month, 600,000 people a year coming across the border. How do you stop that? And what's wrong with zero tolerance? The idea, you come across the border, you broke the law, we're going to prosecute you.
Three things. First, Chris, you're right. There are no easy fixes to this problem. And Washington is bad at investing in long-term solutions. Number two, history will tell you, lessons learned in 2014, you can do certain things that will drive down illegal migration in the short term, as we did in 2014. But then the longer-term patterns always revert to form. The numbers always creep back up. President Trump himself saw that in 2017. The numbers went down dramatically, and then they're back up again. And so you can do these things, but we've got to make the longer-term investments in dealing with illegal migration generally. And if we don't do that, we're going to continue to have this problem.
One final question, because the practical result of the program that the Obama administration put in was that you had to release. You caught and had to release some of the people with a promise and sometimes an ankle bracelet that they would come back. I want to put up some numbers on the screen because according to government numbers, 74% of those who were released showed up for their hearings last year. But that still left almost 40,000 people who didn't show up for deportation hearings. So catch and release, which is what the practical effect was under the Obama administration and until this year for the Trump administration, that doesn't really work either, does it?
Well, without a doubt, it's a problem, Chris, which is one of the reasons we expanded family detention, which was controversial. A lot of people...
And was knocked down by the court. That's the reason we got this 20-day ruling. It was because of the Obama administration's policy.
Well, we expanded family detention, and then we ran into the issue of the Flores case, which you mentioned a moment ago. I disagreed then with the ruling in the Flores case because I think that our Border Patrol and our immigration enforcement people need those tools available to deal with situations like this. But it's a sheer matter of numbers, Chris. Right now, we have family detention capability for about 3,000 or 4,000 people, and you've got over 1,000 migrants crossing the border a day in Central America. And so even if you emptied it out completely today, it would fill back up in a matter of days.
Right.
So there you are. This is not an easy problem, which is why we need to invest and address the underlying causes.
Secretary Johnson, thank you. Thanks for joining us today. Always good to
jacket.
I don't know that I have seen more of a head-scratching moment in an administration where we scratch our heads a lot covering them than that jacket. Everyone in the press room, in the press briefing room where we work, there were audible gasps.
Can't
what is
be an
she
accident,
doing?
not possible.
This is not an
impossible.
accident. This is not an accident. The question is, and the answer that we don't have is, to whom was this message directed? Was this at the media, like the president said, and there's absolutely no evidence that's the case? Was this to him? We don't know. Nonetheless, whatever it was, it completely took away from the story. She was down there to show that she cared about undocumented immigrant children being detained on the border, and we end up talking about a coat.
You know, it really doesn't matter what the First Lady was trying to say with her jacket. You know what it did? It distracted us from talking about these children. I wanted to hear her talk about the babies. Are they being held? Are they being fed? Is someone changing their diapers? It distracted us from what her message was to go down to the border, to show compassion, and to show the American people someone is taking care of these children. That jacket was a huge mistake.
Do you know how it happened?
No, I don't know how it happened. But I also say this.
and I was saying this before to the folks in the room, part of it is our fault too. Because, she did get on the plane and go down there to see for herself what was in my mind. Right. She was a major motivator in that White House behind the executive order and pushing the president to do that and getting him away from the DOJ, interpretation of all this. And so, but we spent 75 or 80% of our time, depending upon what outlet you looked at, in the last couple of days, talking about the jacket. The fact is, this woman is bright, she's hardworking, and she's compassionate. And she went down there to show that the Trump family, in her name, cares about these kids and these families.
But then why did she wear that jacket?
I can't answer. Listen, you'll be shocked to know, looking at me, that Melania doesn't consult me on her fashion.
This wasn't just a jacket. This was a sandwich board. This was like the equivalent of wearing a sandwich board with a message that you wanted to say, which to somebody, and whoever it was wrong. Whether it was to the press, who are basically responsible for the reason why we're talking about this issue and highlighting the families. And if it wasn't to the press, it was to somebody else. She was wearing it for a specific reason. She may be the most compassionate, wonderful person in the world. She wore that jacket for a reason.
But it's also significant that nobody else went to the border. The president didn't go to the border. The Attorney General didn't go to the border to meet with those kids. The Department of Homeland Security Secretary didn't go to the border. She went to the border to meet with those kids.
And the First Lady deserves credit for that.
Well, they should have done more, right? And so as so many people in this country are certainly outraged by the cages and the thermal blankets and the facilities housing these kids, they were all there in 2014 under President Obama. And my question to you, Senator Baldwin, is did you speak up against them then?
On this issue that we get into a moment where we're making progress, and then when it stalls, we turn around. I think we all need to continue to be focused on it and press it through. The American people need confidence that we can solve problems. Nobody believes that we have an immigration system that works. It is broken, it needs fixing, but we've just got to resolve to do that.
But were you worried about it then? Did you raise your voice under the Obama administration?
In numbers of cases, usually I remember a constituent who was in detention at the border, arguably very inappropriately, and we raised our voice in that instance and many others. But we've got to do this now in unison. It's not enough to do it case by case or senator or House member by House member. We've got to resolve to fix this issue.
Senator Tammy Baldwin, thank you.
Correspondent for Bloomberg News, Leslie Sanchez is a CBS News political contributor. Paula Reed is a CBS News correspondent, and we talked Ed O'Keefe into sticking around for another segment. I want to pick up on what the president just tweeted, which was, we can't allow these people to invade our country. That language there, Leslie, some will read that as code. Sure. Senator Corker said the president's trying to activate the base ahead of November. What is achieved here?
Absolutely. It's a cringeworthy statement because for the last multiple decades, many within the Republican Party are trying to say, do not dehumanize one group over another. Don't say those people versus our people. We need more inclusive language. When you say these or those, you're separating them from the base, the core of fundamentally trying to protect America as if it's a different thing. For some, it will galvanize because it sends a message that I am focused on ensuring that we are putting the best foot forward in protecting U.S. sovereignty, protecting America's borders, and distancing them from us.
But the president would argue that this is about, as he would lay out, merit-based immigration. This is not about letting people, he uses language that describes sort of flooding, coming over the border, uncontrolled situation.
Yeah. I don't even think it's code. I think he is very clear in what he is saying. And when he talks merit-based immigration, he is very clear. I mean, those comments he made in private in the Oval Office that he wanted more people from Norway and fewer people from Africa and the African nations. He is very clear about where he is on this. And this issue of immigration is one of the most powerful issues for his base. From the moment he announced his candidacy, when he came out and made those remarks that Democrats gasped at about some immigrants being murderers and rapists, that lit a fire under his candidacy very early on. A lot of his supporters saw that and said, who's that guy? I want to vote for him. And I was at that Duluth rally on Wednesday, and the moment that the crowd was the most engaged was those conversations about immigration. That's when they were most engaged. That's when they were most fired up. This is a key issue for him. When I talk to people involved with the campaign, they say he cannot go soft on immigration. His supporters want that wall.
What's so interesting is that what you're describing is a motivating thing for people to go and vote. But Ed, then their elected representatives, when they get here, immigration becomes something that is totally paralyzing,
right,
and they can't legislate around
it. Has been this entire century. These two parties haven't been able to sort it out. They're going to try again in the House, we think, this week. You talked to Jim Jordan earlier about this sort of compromise bill, compromise among Republicans, because this is something that just poisons the well among Republicans so much these days. This bill is unlikely to pass, according to aides, according to what Congressman Jordan suggested. And that is fine in a short-term political sense for several moderate Republicans who will go home to swing districts this fall, because now they'll be able to say, well, at least we tried. At least we had a vote. And we're on the record as supporting, changes to Dreamers and money for the border and all these other things, and the Democrats voted against it. But it's not going to solve the problem. And yes, there are attempts right now to perhaps address this issue of family separation, but even over in the Senate, there's no real appetite to have these discussions. And, you look at this issue this week, and now we talk about family separation. I think one thing we have to remember in this immigration debate, in most cases, the people crossing the border have already been separated from their family. They left Guatemala. They left El Salvador. And maybe as a society and as journalists, we should be worrying not just about what the American Congress is going to do, but what's the El Salvadoran Congress going to do? What's the Honduran Congress going to do? What's the Guatemalan National Assembly going to do? Because something's not going right. And if the United States were perhaps, as a society, as journalists, as lawmakers, as a president, focus a little more on them and say, what can we do to keep them here? Perhaps, this issue will start to mitigate.
That's the balance part of the coin. And if you remember the debate going back in 1996 when we were talking about reform in the 90s, even decertification of Mexico, which Clinton had to face in 1999, was about Mexico not handling the narco trafficking, all the drugs crossing over. So it was putting pressure on Mexico, different parts of Latin America. You don't see, and the argument was there's no bilateral relations, it's going to really damage, but there is not a conversation about specifically what is happening, the push-pull within those countries. You just see the humanitarian crisis.
The president does have two solutions. One, pull aid from countries like El Salvador who are not taking immigration seriously, and two, put in NAFTA an immigration clause that if you don't crack down on immigration, we're going to punish you. So a solution that's far different than a lot of people are probably thinking, but that's his approach.
Paula, I want to ask you about those children who are directly affected right now. There are still about 2,000 in U.S. detention that the administration is trying to reunify. According to our latest poll, though, this is interesting. When asked if this should be a high priority to get kids and their parents back together, 75% of Democrats said it's not a high priority. It is a high priority, while only 23% of Republicans said it was a high priority to reunify.
Well, it's interesting to look at the administration. Clearly, they're aligned with their base, because in the hours following this executive order, we were talking to top Justice Department officials, and there was no plan, and it didn't appear any consideration to how to reunify these children with their parents. And as of right now, this number stands at about, as you said, 2,000. Customs and Border Patrol, they were able to reunify about 500 kids. But as of right now, they say they know where these 2,000 children are, but there is no grand plan for how to reunify them. And in about 3 weeks, unless Congress takes action or a judge in California agrees to modify this rule that says you can only keep a child in federal detention for 20 days, they're going to have to once again start separating families again and have to add to that number. So it is really surprising that over the course of this week, reunifying those children with their families has not been a top priority.
And that is that Flores ruling, that time duration you talked about. And Senator Corker was saying he thinks there might be some way to legislate to give the administration essentially more time, But that just means keeping families behind bars.
Exactly, and then you're going to run into litigation over whether or not you can indefinitely detain children. And children will then be forced to sort of decide, do you want to argue to stay with your family in detention indefinitely up against that 700,000 case backlog, could take years, or do you want to be separated from your family? But as of right now, the executive order, it did not change the administration's policy. They will continue to prosecute every adult who crosses the border illegally. The only difference is now they're trying to keep families together while they do that. But obviously no clear solution on that 20-day deadline yet, because it doesn't seem like Congress is going to get anything passed.
Shannon, the president doesn't like backing down. And that's essentially what he did in this reversal, though he's still pushing us as a campaign issue.
I mean, he even acknowledged publicly that this was a very difficult line for him to walk between being tough on immigration and seeming like he didn't have a heart. I know this was something that they struggled with within the White House. It was very obvious once this became a visual story, once there were photos, once there was audio, that something had to be done. But that executive order also did something where it knocked the legs out from under a lot of attempts in Congress. It pulled away any leverage Congress had to say, listen, we have to do something immediately. Look at the videos, look at the photos, look at these sounds. We have to act. Once that executive order was out there, it took a lot of pressure off Congress. So if there was maybe a 10% chance something would happen, I think it's probably around a 2 to 5% chance.
Yeah, no, it took the legs out from under it. And again, they'll try this week. There is, even if this House compromise bill fails, there are proposals to just focus on the family, so to speak, but even that may not make it through. And the issue over in the Senate is you've got two competing proposals that would essentially allow the families to stay together, and the question will be, do they stay behind bars together, or can they be released? Catch and release is something the president campaigned against and Republicans don't like.
I think there's many Republicans who feel it was an unnecessary evil, and just to put stark contrast on that. But if you back up on this issue a little bit and you look, the president found America's pain point. And it wasn't so much even the pictures as the audio. And a lot of Republicans I talked to, even bundlers, people that put big amounts of money together, said when they heard the cries of the children without visual, being separated, that was the moment where America knew this was too far. And that's when the president retreated.
Leslie, where are Democrats on this, though? Because you aren't hearing an alternative proposal being put forward.
This is exactly what they're going to say. So if the president's political pulse, he's very acute at understanding where this movement, where this wave is. This is breaking up the status quo and the establishment Republican base that's never done anything more, many Republicans would argue, than 10% better than the Democrats. This is actually forcing border security and some sort of enforcement on the U.S.-Mexico border. Now we're talking about even a pathway to citizenship for DACA. Hardliners would never have had that kind of conversation. So it's really, in some ways, people say it's the pressure on the Democrats. It's the pressure on the Republicans. And if you think about it, it is a very galvanizing issue, to her point, for November. I am doing something about it. It's increase the collective consciousness on it. And while we always said, to Ed's point, that immigration is taboo because it depresses ethnic minority vote, this conservative Latino vote, in this case, it galvanizes the rest of his Trump base.
And for years, Republicans have wanted to avoid immigration. It's the third rail of Republican politics. I've never seen Republicans fight over anything as strongly as they fight over immigration. And this president has forced that issue to the surface. He has forced them to talk about it, forced them to confront it.
Jailbreak is what Bob Corker forewarned.
Yeah.
Another issue among Republicans is trade policy right now.
It's going to be a huge issue in Midwestern states. It's going to be a huge issue in the race to succeed Corker in Tennessee, because these are states that rely on manufacturing, on the manufacturing sector, and they're going to take a hit, and I think people are already worried about it.
But there's fear among Republicans to stand up to the president.
Totally, because they'll end up like Bob Corker or Mark Sanford in South Carolina. The problem is they're going to start getting phone calls. They're going to be confronted by voters as they go home on the weekends, and they're going to be able to come back to the president and say, I have no choice. You have to be able to tweak this.
Paula, real quickly, on Peter Strzok, the FBI agent, and this deposition this week, what do Americans need to pay attention to here?
Well, this is the next phase of undermining the origins of the Russia probe. And after we have the Inspector General report, there are some text messages that Strzok sent for which there is no explanation. There is nothing that is going to satisfy the regular Americans. There's no reason that you would want to call a candidate you're investigating a quote effing idiot, or talk about the way his supporters smell. So this is going to be really fertile ground for the president and Republicans who want to undermine the origins of the Russia investigation, because not only was Strzok leading the Clinton investigation, he was also leading the Russia investigation and working with Mueller until he was fired over these texts. So that's definitely going to be something we will hear more about.
All right. Thanks to all of you. We'll be back in a moment with a look at a big change.